The day Inez Rourke buried her husband, she made a promise to the dry Texas earth that she would never again let a man close enough to break something inside her. And she raised her daughter, Callie, on that promise like it was scripture. It was the autumn of 1879 when the dust first settled on that vow, out on the edge of a town called Harlow Creek in the hill country of central Texas, where the cedar trees grew stubborn and low, and the sky stretched itself out so wide and blue that a person could almost believe the world was merciful. Almost. Clara Rourke, who went by Callie from the time she could walk, was 3 years old when her father, Dale Rourke, rode out one morning on a borrowed horse and never came home. He had been a gambler and a charmer and a man with the kind of laugh that made you forget he owed half the county money. When they found him face down in a creek bed 2 counties over, shot through the back, Inez did not cry at his grave. She cried later, alone in the kitchen with her hands pressed flat against the wooden table, and when the crying stopped she wiped her face clean and started figuring out how to survive. She took in laundry. She kept a garden. She traded eggs from 6 brown hens, and eventually, she saved enough to buy a small piece of land at the south end of Harlow Creek, where she planted a kitchen garden and raised Callie in a 2-room house with a good tin roof and a door that locked. The town knew her as a capable woman, a quiet woman, a woman who nodded politely and turned down every invitation that might lead somewhere soft and dangerous. The widows and the shop wives respected her. The men learned quickly not to press. There was something in the steadiness of her gray eyes that communicated, without cruelty, that she was not available for anyone's charm. Callie grew up watching her mother's hands always moving, always working, kneading bread or hanging wet cotton sheets or pulling stubborn weeds from the garden rows. She grew up hearing, not in lectures but in the small daily lessons her mother offered without announcing them, that men were creatures who came and went, that a woman's security was a thing she built herself or she did not have at all, that love was a word men used to unlock doors they had no business opening. Inez never said these things with bitterness exactly, but with a kind of flat certainty, the way a person describes weather. It rains. The wind picks up. Men leave or they get themselves killed or they spend what you saved on cards and whiskey, and then they leave anyway. Callie absorbed every word because she loved her mother without reservation. She was a quick girl, with her father's dark hair and her mother's gray eyes, which in certain light looked almost silver. By the time she was 18, in 1894, she could mend harness leather, keep accounts in a clean hand, manage the small dry goods counter her mother had opened on the south end of the main road, and she could sit a horse well enough that old Deacon Prout, who ran the livery, said she rode like she was born to it. She was also, quietly, a person who felt everything very deeply, who cried when she read certain passages in the few books they owned, who sometimes stood outside at night and looked at the stars with an ache she could not name. She did not mistrust men because she found them repulsive. She mistrusted them because her mother had taught her that trusting one was the beginning of the end of your own story. And Callie Rourke had always intended to be the author of her own story. Then John Maddox rode into Harlow Creek on a gray morning in March of 1894, and things began, quietly and without anyone's permission, to shift. He came from the north, which people noticed because most strangers came up from the south along the main trail. He came riding a big roan horse that looked tired and honest, the horse's head hanging a little in the cold morning mist, and he himself looked much the same, a tall man in a worn brown coat, with a hat that had seen considerable weather and a week's worth of dark stubble on his jaw. He was 28 years old, though Callie would not learn that for some time. He had the kind of face that was not immediately handsome so much as it was interesting, strong jaw, wide-set dark eyes, a nose that had been broken once and healed a little crooked, and a mouth that seemed at rest, to be deciding something. He stopped at Deacon Prout's livery first, which was the right thing to do, and he paid 2 days in advance for his horse's board, which Deacon noted admiringly to anyone who would listen, because strangers in Harlow Creek did not always extend that courtesy. He took a room at the Granger Hotel on the main road, and he ate a quiet breakfast at the hotel's side table, and then he walked to the land office, which was 3 doors south of the dry goods counter that Inez Rourke ran with Callie's help. Callie saw him through the counter window, crossing the road, and she watched him the way she might watch a hawk riding a thermal, with interest but no particular alarm. He was just a man passing through, probably, the way men did. Harlow Creek sat at the junction of 2 cattle trails, and there was no shortage of strangers in the spring months when the drives began to move north. She went back to her ledger and thought nothing more of it. The trouble, or rather the beginning, came 2 days later when Mrs. Bowers gelding threw a shoe on the north road, and Mrs. Bower, who was 71 and did not ride horses herself but sent her hired man out on them, needed the animal brought back to the livery. Her hired man had taken sick. There was no one immediately available. Callie, who happened to be carrying a wrapped parcel to the Bower house for her mother, offered to lead the animal back to the livery herself. It was not a complicated task. The gelding was gentle and tired, and the road was straight. She was halfway back to the livery, the gelding plodding along behind her on a loose lead rope, when a stray dog, one of the yellow ones that ran behind the feed store, shot out from between 2 buildings, with a racket of barking that sent the gelding sideways in a blind spook. The lead rope burned through Callie's hand before she could tighten her grip, and the gelding bolted north at a full run with its bridle reins flapping and Callie standing in the road with a stinging palm and a profound irritation. She started after the animal at a jog because there was nothing else sensible to do, and she had gone perhaps 50 yards when she saw the man in the brown coat step calmly out of the gap between the farrier's shop and the grain store, take the gelding's reins in one hand with the easy certainty of a man who had done such things 1,000 times, and bring the horse to a smooth, talking stop in the middle of the road. He turned and walked the gelding back toward her, and when he was close enough she could see that he was not smiling in a way that was pleased with himself, which she had expected and which would have annoyed her. He was simply looking at her with those wide-set dark eyes, checking, she realized, whether she had been hurt. "Your hand," he said. She looked down. The rope burn was red across her palm, not serious but bright. "I'm fine," she said, which was true enough. "You were leading him to the livery?" he asked. "I was," she said. He fell into step beside her without being invited, the gelding walking calmly at his shoulder. Callie noted that the horse, who had just been a panicked idiot, was now thoroughly settled. She noted further that the man had not said anything else, had not introduced himself, had not explained where he was going or made any conversational gambit that required her to respond. He simply walked with her. At the livery, Deacon Prout came out and took the gelding and then looked at the man and said, with the warmth of 2 days' familiarity, "I see you've met Miss Rourke, Mr. Maddox." "Not formally," the man said, and then he looked at her and removed his hat and said, "John Maddox, I'm sorry about your hand." "Callie Rourke," she said, "and it is not your fault." He nodded once, replaced his hat, and walked back toward the hotel. That was all. She thought about it 3 times that evening, which she considered 2 times too many. She found out, over the following days, what was already becoming the talk of the town's quieter conversationalists, that John Maddox had filed papers at the land office on the old Harker property, 600 acres of brushy hill country land on the east side of the creek that had been sitting fallow since old Jim Harker died intestate, and his children in San Antonio had spent 4 years in a legal argument about it. The children had finally sold. John Maddox had bought it with money that the land office clerk told the barber, who told the hotel owner, who told his wife, who told Inez Rourke, appeared to be legitimate cattle money earned over several years up in the Indian Territory and Kansas. Inez received this information with exactly the neutral expression she gave most information about men. Cattle money could mean many things. Men bought land for many reasons. She told Callie what she had heard and watched her daughter's face for a reaction, and Callie gave her mother the same neutral face back, which Inez recognized as her own and felt, briefly, proud of. What Inez could not see was what happened to Callie's chest when she heard the word legitimate. The ranch, which John Maddox began calling the Double R, though nobody knew yet what the two R's stood for, became a project of considerable local interest over the following weeks. He hired two men from Harlow Creek, brothers named Cord and Eli Stetler, both of whom had worked cattle before and were decent and sober. And he hired a third man, an older Mexican vaquero named Augusto Villa, who had ridden with good outfits for 30 years, and whose skill with horses and cattle was, by any measure, exceptional. The four of them worked from first light to last, and within 3 weeks there was a new fence line along the east road, and the beginnings of a solid barn going up where the old one had collapsed. Harlow Creek watched and talked and reserved judgment, which was the town's general practice with newcomers. Men had come before with ambitions and solid plans, and left within a year when the land proved harder than they expected, or the loneliness proved harder than the land. Callie saw John Maddox in town perhaps twice a week. He came for supplies. She helped her mother at the dry goods counter 3 days a week, and he was polite and direct and specific about what he needed. He did not linger. He did not make small talk. He paid in cash and thanked whoever served him and left. She found herself, with a discomfort she could not entirely suppress, noticing when he came through the door, noticing the way he moved, which was deliberate, noticing the way he spoke, which was economical but never rude, noticing that he did not look at her the way some men looked at young women, with that particular brand of calculation that made her feel like something being appraised at market. He looked at her the way he seemed to look at most things, steadily, directly, and without apparent agenda. It was the middle of April when the incident at the creek happened that changed the nature of their acquaintance. Callie had ridden out to the southern pasture to check on a section of fence that her mother's one remaining cow, an old black and white named Margaret, had reportedly been leaning on with criminal determination. She found the fence, assessed the damage, decided the wire could wait until she fetched proper tools, and turned her horse, a steady bay mare named Scout, toward home along the creek trail. The creek was running high with spring rain, brown and fast, and considerably more persuasive than it looked. Callie had crossed it a dozen times at the usual ford, a shallow gravel stretch where the water barely cleared a horse's fetlocks in normal times. Today it came up past Scout's knees, and the current pushed against the mare's legs with a purposeful kind of strength. Scout was steady, but halfway across she planted her feet and refused to move forward, and Callie, who trusted Scout's instincts more than she trusted her own assessment of water, tried to turn her back toward the bank she had come from. In trying to turn in fast current, the mare's hind legs slipped on the gravel bottom. She went briefly sideways, overcorrected, and Callie, who had not expected the sudden lurch, came out of the saddle and into the water. The creek in April in the Texas Hill Country was cold. It took her breath completely. She went under for a moment that felt much longer than it was, found her footing on the slick gravel bottom, got her head up and gasped, and then found that the current was considerably more interested in her than she was in it. Scout had found her feet and was scrambling toward the far bank, riderless. Callie got her boots down and tried to stand, but the gravel rolled under her feet and the water hit her in the chest like a hand pushing. She managed to grab a low cedar branch that had fallen into the creek's edge, and she held it while the water tried to peel her away from it, and she thought, with great clarity, that this was profoundly undignified and that she needed to not let go of the branch. Then there was a horse in the water beside her, a big roan horse that she recognized with a jolt, and John Maddox was leaning down from the saddle with his arm extended, his hat off somewhere behind him, his expression not panicked but concentrated. "Take my arm," he said, and his voice was calm enough that she trusted it immediately, which she would think about later because she trusted almost nothing that immediately. She grabbed his forearm with both hands. He had a grip like a vice gate. He pulled her up and sideways in a single smooth motion that must have required considerable strength, and she landed half across the roan's neck and then scrambled to sit behind Maddox on the horse's back as the animal moved steadily, unhurried, toward the shallower water near the bank. The horse never panicked. It seemed to share its rider's disposition. When they reached solid ground, Callie slid off the horse's hindquarters on her own, which was important to her, and stood dripping in the April sunshine while Maddox got down and retrieved his hat from where it had caught on a cedar branch upstream. She was shaking, not entirely from cold. "That Ford has been running deceptive for 2 weeks," he said, coming back to her. He was looking at her again in that assessing way. "You're not hurt?" "No," she said. Her teeth were chattering. He reached into his saddlebag without apparent self-consciousness and pulled out a folded shirt, clean, worn soft from washing, and held it out to her. "It's dry," he said simply. She took it because she was cold, and because refusing it would have been performatively stubborn rather than principled. She pulled it over her wet shirt, and it was warm from the saddlebag, and it smelled faintly of cedar and clean soap, and she was for a moment terribly aware of all of it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He caught Scout, who had made it across the creek and was grazing 50 yards off as if nothing of note had occurred, and led the mare back to her. He checked the mare's legs quickly, efficiently, the way Callie had seen Deacon Prout do it, not showily, just checking. "She's all right," he said. "I know," Callie said, and then, because she was honest by nature, she said, "I trusted her instincts over mine, and I should have gotten off before she tried to turn." He looked at her then with something that was not quite a smile, but that transformed his expression briefly into something warmer. "Creek's high," he said. "It happens." She rode home in his dry shirt, and she hung it by the fire to remember to return it, and she sat with her hands around a cup of coffee, and she thought, with a certain resigned clarity, that John Maddox was not like anything she had been taught to expect. She returned the shirt the following Tuesday when she was at the dry goods counter, and he came in for a coil of fence wire and a box of staples. She had washed and folded it, and she held it out to him across the counter with a direct, steady look that she had learned from her mother. "Thank you again," she said. He took the shirt and looked at the folded edge, which she had pressed neatly. "You didn't have to iron it," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost amused. "I iron things I borrow," she said. "Miss Rourke," he said, and there was a quality of decision in his voice, the same quality she had noticed in his face when she first saw him crossing the road that first morning. "I wonder if you'd be willing to tell me which of the farms on the South Road sells good vegetable seedlings? I'm trying to establish a kitchen garden, and I don't know the ground yet." It was such a straightforward question, so entirely without guile, that she answered it without thinking about whether she should. "Mrs. Polasek," she said, "on the road past the church. She starts tomatoes and sweet peppers from seed every February, and she sells what she doesn't use. Her corn seedlings are also worth having." "Much obliged," he said, and he paid for his wire and staples and left. She told herself, as she wrote the purchase in the ledger, that she was not going to think about it. She thought about it. Inez noticed, of course. Inez noticed things about Callie, the way a person notices the weather when they have spent decades learning to read it. She noticed the slight shift in Callie's expression when Maddox came into the store. She noticed that Callie had ironed that shirt before returning it, which Callie never did with her own shirts. She noticed that her daughter's eyes went to the window on the days Maddox was likely to come in for supplies. She said nothing for 2 weeks. She was not a woman who spoke before she had thought something through, and this required considerable thought. On a Sunday evening in late April, when they were sitting together on the porch after supper, watching the light go orange and slow across the cedar hills, Inez said, without preamble, "Tell me what you know about John Maddox." Callie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He works hard. He pays what he owes. He does not talk more than he means to. He pulled me out of the creek when Scout slipped." Inez turned to look at her daughter. "You were in the creek." "I should have gotten off before she tried to turn," Callie said. "It was my own misjudgment." Inez looked back at the hills, and he happened to be there. He was riding the east road. He saw Scout without a rider. The silence stretched out between them, not uncomfortably. Their silences were generally like that two people who had lived closely enough together that they did not need to fill every moment. "Your father," Inez said finally, "was also a man who seemed to have his head on straight when I first knew him." "I know," Callie said. "He was charming and he worked hard when he wanted to, and he could make you feel, when he looked at you, like you were the only thing in the room." "Mama," Callie said softly. "I'm not saying any of this is the case with Maddox," Inez said. "I am saying that I recognized those qualities in your father long after they had begun to mean something to me, and by then the recognizing was not quite enough." Callie looked at her mother's hands on her lap, those capable, work-worn hands that had held their family together through 15 years of effort and refusal. She felt, with a complicated tenderness, that her mother was trying to protect something she did not entirely understand yet. "I've talked to him twice," Callie said. "About a horse and about vegetable seedlings." Inez made a small sound that was neither disagreement nor agreement. She reached over and pressed her daughter's hand once, and then they sat together in the orange light until the fireflies came up from the grass. May arrived, and the Harlow Creek Spring Social was held at the Grange Hall on the second Saturday, the way it had been held every year since 1871. The whole town came. It was too small a town to have the social be anything other than a communal event. And there was fiddle music and food brought from every household, and the kind of loud, layered conversation that happened when people who had spent the winter in relative isolation were suddenly all in the same room. Callie wore a blue dress that her mother had made from a good calico 2 summers previous, and she wore her hair down, which she rarely did, because it was a social and her mother had said nothing about it one way or another, which meant it was permitted. She felt, in the candle-lit hall with the fiddles going and the smell of food and cedar and tobacco and pressed clothes, something she recognized as happiness. She danced the first reel with Cord Stetler, who was a boisterous dancer and clearly enjoying himself without any agenda beyond the dancing itself, which was pleasant. She danced the second with the schoolteacher's husband, old Mr. Finch, who danced with every woman in the room out of courtly habit. She ate apple cake with the Bower girls and talked about whether it was going to be a dry summer, which was the hill country's perennial anxiety. She saw John Maddox come in at 8:30. He had cleaned up, the brown coat had been exchanged for a dark wool jacket that fit him better than she would have expected, given how he dressed normally, and he had shaved, and he moved through the room with the same deliberate quiet that he carried everywhere. He spoke to Deacon Prout. He spoke to Cord Stetler's mother. He accepted a piece of cake from Mrs. Polasic and spoke with her for several minutes, and Callie, who was watching this from across the room without meaning to, noticed that he listened when Mrs. Polasic spoke. Not politely waited, actually listened. He did not ask Callie to dance. He was on the other side of the room for most of the evening, and she was on hers, and there was nothing between them except the length of the Grange Hall and the sound of the fiddles. But near the end of the evening, when the music had slowed and people were collecting their dishes and saying their good nights, she was standing near the side door getting her shawl from the hook, and he appeared beside her, also getting his hat from the hook next to hers, the way things sometimes arranged themselves without anyone's planning. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening, Mr. Maddox. Miss Rourke." He held the door for her and she went through it, and they stood for a moment on the side step in the warm May night, the fiddle music just audible through the walls, the stars enormously present over the hill country dark. "Mrs. Polasic tells me her seedlings are the best in 3 counties, he said. "She says that herself," Callie said, and there it was, a smile, quick and involuntary, that she felt cross her face before she could stop it. And then he smiled. Not the considering expression she usually saw, but an actual smile, and it changed his whole face the way a lamp changes a room, and she stood there in the warm May night and felt the ground beneath her shift just slightly, the way it had in the creek, and this time there was nothing to hold on to. She said good night and walked home with her mother, who had been watching from the doorway, and Inez said nothing the whole walk home except to comment on the evening being warm for May, and Callie said yes, it was, and they let the silence carry them the rest of the way. June arrived hot in particular. The double R was taking shape, even Callie could see it from the east road. The barn standing solid now, new fence lines running clean across the hillside, a garden patch visible near the house that she suspected had come from Mrs. Polasek's seedlings. The town's general opinion of John Maddox was moving toward approval in the way that small western towns approved of people slowly, with reservations, but with increasing sincerity. He began coming into the dry goods counter more often as the ranch built out, and the nature of those visits shifted, by such small degrees that it was difficult to say when exactly it changed, from transactional to something else. He asked her opinion on things, whether the salt pork from the new barrel was worth the price over the old suppliers, whether the oilcloth they had gotten in recently was a heavier grade than what had been stocked before. They were practical questions, the kind a person asked someone they had decided to treat as knowledgeable, and she answered them in kind. One afternoon in late June he came in and the store was empty except for her, and he bought what he needed and then stood at the counter a moment and said, without the frame of a practical question, "Are you happy here, in Harlow Creek?" She looked at him. It was an unusual question, the most personal thing he had said to her in 3 months of conversation. "Yes," she said after a moment. "My mother built something real here. I'm proud of it." He nodded slowly. "You run the counter like you care about it." "I do care about it." "That's not as common as you'd think," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her believe he had seen a great deal of places and operations that were run by people who didn't care, and that this had been instructive. She asked, before she could decide not to, "Where did you come from, before Kansas?" He was quiet for a moment. "Missouri," he said. "My father had a farm there. He died when I was 17. My older brother took it over. I went north." 17 is young to go north. "It was that or watch a man who didn't want me there decide what I was worth," he said, and then he seemed to hear the weight of what he had said and he looked briefly away and then back at her, and she saw in that look something she recognized, not self-pity, which she would have instinctively resisted, but the flat acknowledgement of a difficult truth. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "It turned out all right," he said. "I learned cattle, I learned country, I saved what I earned." He paused. "Eventually, you learn what you're worth on your own terms." She looked at him across the counter, and she felt something move in her chest that was different from anything she had felt before, not the giddy flutter she had read about in novels, but something slower and more serious and considerably more alarming for its seriousness. Something that said, "This person is real." She told herself, riding home that evening, that she was being foolish. She told herself that her mother was right and that men were capable of saying things that sounded real without being so. She told herself all the things she had been taught. The things she had been taught did not quite cover John Maddox. July was hot and full of work, and somehow the work kept finding ways to put her in proximity to him. Cord Stetler brought a mare to the livery with a leg problem and asked Callie's opinion. She had some knowledge of it from years of working the animals with Deacon Prout, and John Maddox happened to be there collecting some tack he had left for repair, and the three of them stood around the mare's stall and talked about the injury and the possible treatment. And Callie noticed that Maddox deferred to her assessment without making it visible, which was a thing she had not experienced from a man before. She began, with a care she was honest enough to call deliberate, talking with Callie about John Maddox. Not romantically, she would not have been able to say it directly, but by asking questions about the ranch and how it was coming, and finding ways to mention what she had observed of him in town. Her mother listened to all of this with the same neutral attention she gave most things, and one evening in July she said, "Bring him to supper." Callie stared at her. "I'm not saying I think anything of the man," Inez said, with the careful precision of a woman stating the rules of an engagement. "I'm saying I have heard your voice change when you talk about him. I have watched you for 20 years and I know what it means when you try that hard not to say something. Bring him to supper and I will decide what I think for myself." "Mama," Callie said. "Don't mama me," Inez said. "I am not made of stone and I am not a fool. I raised you careful because I was hurt and I wanted better for you. That doesn't mean better cannot exist." She paused. "Bring him to supper." Callie's hands were still in her lap for a long moment. "He might say no," she said. "Then he says no," Inez said. "He did not say no." When Callie asked him, with a directness she made herself maintain by sheer force of character, whether he would like to come to supper on Friday evening to meet her mother, he looked at her with those level dark eyes and said yes, without hesitation, and then he said, "I'll bring something. Is there anything Mrs. Rourke particularly likes?" The question undid her slightly. "She likes good coffee," Callie said. He brought a brown paper parcel of coffee beans from San Antonio, a luxury, and a jar of wild honey that Augusto Vila had found on the ranch land. He arrived exactly when she had told him to, which was 7 in the evening, and he knocked on the door with the jar of honey in one hand and the coffee in the other, and he stood in the doorway of the Rourke kitchen looking, Callie thought, watching him like a man who understood that he was being assessed and was not afraid of it. Inez Rourke shook his hand. She was 52 years old, a compact woman with silver hair still threaded with black, and those same gray eyes that she had given her daughter, and she looked at John Maddox with the focused, patient attention of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning to read people, because her survival had sometimes depended on it. "Mr. Maddox," she said. "Sit down." He sat. The supper was chicken and corn and biscuits, and the evening was warm enough that the door was left open to the last of the daylight. Inez asked him questions that were not rude but were not soft either, about his land, about where he had worked before, about his intentions for the Double R in terms of what he planned to run and how many head, and what his market route was going to be. They were the questions, Callie realized with a start, of someone who knew something about cattle business, which made sense because Inez had been paying attention to this country for 15 years. John Maddox answered every question directly. He did not embellish. He did not sell himself. When he did not know something he said so, which happened twice. Once regarding what the East Creek's water rights situation was going to be, and once regarding whether he would try sheep alongside cattle in the East pasture, which was drier ground, and both times he said, plainly, that he was still figuring it out. Inez poured the coffee after supper. She had ground the beans he brought and the kitchen smelled extraordinary from it, and she looked at him across the table and said, "What does the Double R stand for?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I named it after the road. There are 2 ruts worn into the east approach to the property from years of previous use. I liked the look of them, something lasting in the landscape." Inez looked at him steadily. Then she looked at Callie. Then she looked back at him. "My husband," she said, "was a man who told me what he thought I wanted to hear. He was very good at it. I learned later that what I had taken for honesty was performance." She paused. "I have been teaching my daughter to be careful of that for a very long time." "That seems wise," Maddox said. "I'm telling you this," Inez said, "because I want you to know that I am watching you, Mr. Maddox, not with dislike, but with attention." "I understand," he said. "Good," she said, and she poured him more coffee, which Callie interpreted, knowing her mother, as a significant gesture. After he left, he shook Inez's hand at the door and thanked her for the supper in a way that was genuine without being excessive. Callie cleaned the dishes and her mother sat at the table with the last of the coffee and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "He is not your father." "No," Callie agreed. "I am not ready," Inez said slowly, "to say that every man is your father. I believe I have been saying that without saying it, and I think I may have been not entirely correct." Callie put down the dish she was drying and turned around. Her mother was looking at the table, and in her mother's face she could see, beneath the gray-eyed steadiness, a kind of effortful courage that made her throat tight. "Mama," she said. "I still want you to be careful," Inez said. "I will always want that, but careful is not the same as closed." She looked up at her daughter. "He listened tonight. He didn't pretend. I don't know enough yet to say more than that, but he is worth knowing more about." Coming from Inez Rourke, this was as close to a blessing as anything she had offered in 20 years. Callie crossed the kitchen and put her arms around her mother, who held her with both arms, and neither of them said anything more for a long while. August came, and with it the heat that the hill country saved for summer, a dry and particular heat that sat over the cedar ridges and turned the grass gold and made the creek run slow and green. The Double R was running its first small herd, 32 head of mixed longhorns, that Maddox and the Stetler brothers had driven up from San Antonio over 3 days, and the ranch had a settled, working quality now, the kind that spoke of intention fulfilled rather than just begun. Callie rode out to the Double R for the first time in early August on a purpose that was practical. Her mother had asked her to deliver an order of dry goods that Maddox had placed, but that was too large for him to carry on horseback, and she took Scout and the pack mule and rode the 6 miles of East Road in the morning before the heat built. The ranch received her with a kind of beauty she had not expected. The new barn was solid and clean, its cypress boards still pale, the hay inside fragrant. The garden she had seen from a distance was, up close, a genuinely impressive kitchen garden, the tomatoes heavy on their stakes, the sweet peppers green and abundant, the corn tall and good. A wide porch ran along the front of the ranch house, which was small but solidly built, and from the porch you could see the creek line of cedar and the hills rolling east in their particular summer gold. Maddox came out of the barn when he heard the horses, and he helped her unload the pack mule with efficient, matter-of-fact assistance. And when the supplies were stacked in the kitchen, he offered her cold water from the well, which in August heat was the best possible hospitality. They sat on the porch steps and drank cold water and looked at the hills, and she asked about the herd and he told her. And she asked about the water rights situation he had mentioned to her mother. And he said he had spoken to a lawyer in Fredericksburg, and it was more or less resolved in his favor. And then he asked about the dry goods business, and she told him. And the conversation moved with the ease of two people who had learned, over months, the particular geography of each other's minds. Then he said, "Miss Rourke, Callie." He had never used her first name before. She looked at him. He was looking at the hills, and his jaw had the set of a man who had decided something and was following it through. "I'd like to court you properly," he said. "If you're willing, with your mother's awareness, I want to do this right." Callie's hands tightened around the tin cup. She felt the thing in her chest that she had been feeling all summer expand and press against her ribs, and she sat with it for a moment, this terrifying, generous present tense feeling. And she thought about her mother in the kitchen saying, "He is not your father." And she thought about 15 years of careful instruction and what it had built in her, not just walls, but something real beneath the walls, a sense of herself that she trusted. She trusted herself to know what was true. And what was true, right now, sitting on the porch of the Double R in the August heat with the cedar hills going gold before her, was that John Maddox was the most genuinely steady person she had ever met, and that she had been paying attention for 5 months, and that what she had paid attention to had held up. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." He looked at her then, and the warmth that moved through his expression was so unguarded and real that she felt the last of the held-back thing in her chest simply give way, like a gate finally opened, and she was not afraid of what was on the other side. He rode back to town with her that afternoon to speak with Inez Rourke. Inez received the news with the composed dignity that she received most things, but Callie, who knew her mother's face the way she knew the back of her own hands, saw the complicated motion that passed through it, grief for old wounds, recognition of something new, the hard and deliberate opening of a door that had been shut for a very long time. She asked Maddox to sit down. She made coffee. She asked him, with the same direct attention she had given him at supper, what his intentions were, and he told her clearly. He wanted to court Callie with the prospect of marriage. He understood this was serious. He had no intention of offering anything less than a full and committed life. He told her about his finances, which were solid, about the land which was paid for, about the work he was building and what he expected it to grow into over the next several years. Inez listened to all of it, and then she said, "My daughter is not a practical matter to be arranged, Mr. Maddox." "No," he said. "She isn't. I'm telling you the practical things because they're the ones you can verify, and I want you to be able to verify them. The rest of it, the feeling, you'll have to watch for that yourself over time because words about it aren't worth much." Inez looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "All right, court her, and I will be watching." "I expect nothing less," he said. That fall was the most alive Callie Rourke had ever felt. The courtship moved with the care that both of them, by different routes, had learned to value, not rushed, not performed, but present and attentive, and full of the genuine pleasure of two people who were discovering each other without pretense. He came to supper twice a week. He and Callie rode together on Sunday mornings, which her mother permitted with the understanding that they stayed on roads or visible terrain. They talked on those rides with the freedom that movement and open country allowed about everything, about nothing, about the things that had shaped them and the things they wanted. She told him about her father because it was relevant and because she was not the kind of person who hid relevant things. She told him that she had grown up being taught that trust was a vulnerability. He listened without defending his sex or offering reassurances, which was the right response, because the right response to a real thing is to acknowledge it, not to paper over it. He told her more about Missouri, about his older brother, who had been cruel in the particular way that older brothers could be cruel when a father favored them, and about leaving at 17 with $12 and a bedroll, and about the first outfit he worked with in Kansas, a mixed-race crew running cattle for a man named Patterson, who paid fairly and asked no questions about a man's origins as long as he worked. He told her that Patterson had been the first man who had modeled for him what a fair person in a position of authority looked like, and that it had mattered more than he could easily explain. She told him about the books she loved. He told her that he read, which surprised her and then did not surprise her. He had been reading his way through everything available from the small lending library that the Methodist Church kept for the community, and he had opinions about what he read, careful, considered opinions that engaged her own, and they discovered that they argued well together, with a pleasure in the argument that had nothing to do with winning. Inez watched all of this with her careful attention, and what she saw, through the months of that fall, October's coming cool, November's early frosts, the cedar trees going their own deep winter green, was a man who showed up when he said he would, who treated her daughter with a respect that did not condescend, who spoke to Inez herself with the same directness he gave everyone, who did not change his behavior when he thought he was not being watched. That last thing she tested, deliberately, by contriving to be present in situations where he did not know she was, and he was, consistently, the same person. In November, over a supper of venison stew that Maddox had brought from a deer taken on the Double R land, Inez asked him, "Are you a patient man, Mr. Maddox?" "I try to be," he said. "My daughter is going to need to be able to trust in her bones, not just in her head," Inez said. "The head part has happened, I can see that much. The bones part takes longer." "I know," he said. "Are you prepared for that?" He looked at Inez Rourke, this woman who had built a life from the ground up on her own strength, who had poured 15 years of careful love and careful teaching into her daughter, who was sitting here now at her own table asking a man whether he was worthy of what she had raised, and he said, with a straightforwardness that was the truest thing he had offered in months of true things, "Mrs. Rourke, I'm not going anywhere. The Double R is my ground. This is where I intend to live the rest of my life. I have no agenda here except the honest one." Inez was quiet for a moment, then she said, "My daughter trusts you." "I know," he said. "I intend to earn it every day." Inez looked at her coffee cup. Then she looked at Callie. And then she did something Callie had not seen her mother do in a very long time. She smiled, a full and unguarded smile, the kind that reached her eyes and softened the careful lines of her face into something that showed, behind all those years of careful management, A woman who had once been young and hopeful, and who was, in this moment, allowing herself to be hopeful again on her daughter's behalf. "Well," she said, and her voice was a little rough at the edges, "in that case, you had better call me Inez." The winter of 1894 into 1895 settled over the hill country with its particular dry cold, and the Double R hunkered down with its cattle and its horses and its 3 hired men, and the Rourke house on the South Road settled in with its winter work and its evening reading and its twice-weekly suppers with John Maddox. Those winter evenings had a quality that Callie would remember all her life. The lamp on the table casting gold across the checked cloth, her mother at the other end with her mending or her accounts, and John Maddox across from Callie, sometimes reading aloud from whatever book the lending library had surrendered to him, sometimes talking, sometimes just present in the comfortable silence of people who had stopped needing to fill space. He had a low, steady voice, the kind that carried without effort, and when he read aloud from the novels, he had developed a particular attachment to the works of Mr. Mark Twain, and his reading of those had sent all 3 of them into laughter several times. The room felt full in a way that Callie had not known it was empty. She kissed him for the first time on a cold February evening, standing on the south porch as he was leaving, and it was not by his initiation. It was hers, entirely, because she had decided, and she was her mother's daughter enough to act on a decision once it was made. He was startled for just a moment, and then his hands came up to hold her face with a gentleness that was its own kind of eloquence, and the cold air moved around them, and the stars were enormous overhead, and she thought, "This is the feeling the books are about." He asked her to marry him in March of 1895, 1 year after he had ridden into Harlow Creek on his tired roan horse. He did it on the Double R porch at sunset, with no ceremony other than the direct and simple fact of it, standing in front of her with his hat in his hands, and those dark eyes absolutely certain, asking her whether she would make this life with him, this life on this land that was still growing into what it was going to be. This life that would be hard in the ways that all lives on this land were hard and good in the ways that this land could also be good. She said yes. She said it the way she had said the first yes without hesitation, from the deep certain place in her that had been watching him for a year and had found nothing that contradicted itself. He went to speak with Inez that same evening. Inez was in the kitchen when they came in together, and she looked at their faces and she knew before either of them spoke. She set down her spoon and she turned fully around and she looked at John Maddox for a long moment. "You're asking me," she said. "Yes," he said. "She's 21 years old," Inez said. "She doesn't need my permission." "No," he said, "but I want your blessing, that's different." Inez Rourke stood in her kitchen with the evening light coming through the window, and she looked at the man her daughter had trusted. This man who had come from nowhere particular and made something real from nothing, who had sat at her table all winter and been consistent and honest and patient, who had come here tonight to ask for her blessing, not because he needed it legally, but because he understood what it meant to her, and to Callie that she give it. She felt something in her chest release. Something she had been holding for a very long time. Something that had been put there by grief and fear and the long hard years of doing everything alone, and that had served its purpose, had kept them safe, had built something real, but that had also, she was honest enough to admit now, become its own kind of prison. She crossed the kitchen and took John Maddox's hand in both of hers, and she said, "You have it. You have my blessing without reservation." And then her voice did break just slightly at the edges, and she said, "Take care of her." Not because she can't take care of herself, she can, I made sure of that, but because she deserves to be taken care of as well. "I will," he said, "every day." Callie was crying, which she had not anticipated, and her mother was crying, which she had also not anticipated, and John Maddox stood in the kitchen looking at both of them with an expression of such honest and undefended tenderness that Callie thought later she had never loved him more than in that moment, which was not yet the most she would ever love him, because love, she was learning, was not a fixed amount but a growing thing. They were married in June of 1895 in the small Methodist church in Harlow Creek, in a ceremony that was simple and crowded. The whole town came, because the whole town had been watching this unfold over the preceding year with the invested interest that small communities reserve for things they feel a stake in. Mrs. Polasek cried. Deacon Prout stood with a proprietary air. Cord and Eli Stetler both wore clean shirts. Augusto Vila sat in the front pew and looked solemn and pleased. Inez Rourke walked her daughter down the aisle, because there was no one else who should have done it, and she delivered Callie's hand into John Maddox's with a composure that she had clearly worked very hard to maintain, and only Callie, knowing her mother's face, could see the emotion in the precise set of her jaw and the brightness of her eyes. Maddox looked at Callie in the blue dress she had worn to the first spring social, because it was the best dress she had, and because it suited her, and his face said everything that the ceremony was about to put into words. The vows were the standard Methodist words of that era, and they meant what they meant. And when John said them, he said them looking directly at her with the same directness he had given everything from the beginning, and she said hers the same way. And when they were over, and the minister said they were married, and Maddox kissed her in the clean June light of the church, the assembled population of Harlow Creek made the kind of noise that expressed genuine communal delight. They went home to the Double R as husband and wife, and the hill country summer received them, and the ranch received them, and Callie Maddox stood on the porch of her new home in the long evening light and looked at the hills she was going to know the rest of her life and felt, with a completeness that was entirely new, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Inez took on the dry goods store alone for the first weeks, which she had run alone before and could do again, and she was all right. She was more than all right. The blessing she had given and the release of the thing she had held so long had done something to her that the neighborhood noticed. She was lighter in some way. She moved differently. She smiled more readily. It was as if the weight of 15 years of fierce protection had been set down, not abandoned but resolved, and in its place was something that looked, to those who had known her through those years, remarkably like peace. Summer moved forward with the Double R's expanding operations. Maddox had worked out the water rights and was talking with a man in Austin about a supply contract for the fall drive. And Callie settled into the work of the ranch with the efficiency of someone who had been useful her whole life and simply transferred that usefulness to new terrain. She helped Augusto with the garden, which delighted him to no end because she had knowledge of plants from her mother's long-kept kitchen plot, and the two of them between them expanded the kitchen garden to a scale that kept the ranch in vegetables through summer and into fall. She kept the accounts, which Maddox had been managing adequately but not elegantly, and she discovered that the books, properly organized, showed a ranch that was financially healthier than even Maddox had tracked, because he had a tendency to underestimate the value of the small outputs. She told him this at the kitchen table one evening, and he looked at her figures and then at her and said, "You're right," with a simplicity that pleased her. "I know," she said, and smiled, and he laughed, which was a sound she had worked to earn and kept working to earn because it was worth it. Inez came to the Double R for Sunday supper most weeks through that summer, and she and Maddox developed, over those weeks, an accord that was its own kind of thing, not warm in the easy sense, because Inez was not built for easy warmth, but genuine and mutually respectful, and occasionally, in certain conversations about land management or the dry goods business or the politics of the county, genuinely engaged. Maddox listened to Inez the way he had listened to Mrs. Polasek at the social, with actual attention, and Inez responded to being listened to the way most people did who were not used to it. By August she was calling him John, which she had not done even after she told him to call her Inez, and which Callie noted without comment but with considerable internal satisfaction. In September, Callie told John that she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen after supper, with the directness that had always been her method, and he went very still for a moment and then came around the table to her and held her with both arms, not the provisional hold of someone uncertain, but the full and present hold of someone who was enormously, completely present. "Are you feeling all right?" was the first thing he said when he could speak. "I am fine," she said into his shoulder. "I am very well. Does your mother know?" "Not yet. I wanted to tell you first." He held her for a long time, and the September evening moved through the open kitchen window, and outside on the Double R the horses were quiet in the new barn, and the cedar trees held their dark shape against the sky, and Callie Maddox, who had grown up being taught that trusting a man was the beginning of the end of your own story, pressed her face against her husband's neck, and thought that it was instead, in this particular and improbable case, the beginning of a better one. They told Inez the following Sunday. She received the news with a composure that lasted approximately 4 seconds, after which she held her daughter's hands and pressed them and said, with a voice that was doing its level best to stay steady, "Your father would have," and then she stopped and said instead, "I am very happy, Callie. I am very, very happy." She looked at John over Callie's shoulder. He nodded once, and she nodded back, and between them passed the particular understanding of two people who each, in their own way, had taken a long road to this kitchen on this September afternoon, and who both knew what it had cost and what it was worth. The winter of 1895 was the mildest the hill country had seen in years, which everyone took as a kindness. The Double R came through it well. The herd had grown to 62 head. The hay was more than sufficient. Cord and Eli Stetler both stayed on, and Augusto Vila showed no signs of going anywhere, having found in the ranch and in Callie's kitchen garden a situation that suited him to the last particular. The baby was born in April of 1896 in the ranch house bedroom, with the doctor from Harlow Creek in attendance and Inez present throughout, because Callie had asked her to be, and because nothing in the world would have kept her away. The labor was hard in the way that first labors often were, and long enough that by the end of it everyone in the room was exhausted. And then the child was born, a boy, solid and loud and immediately indignant about the world. And Callie held him against her chest with shaking arms and looked at her mother standing by the window with tears running frankly down her face, and at her husband, who was sitting on the edge of the bed with his hand over his eyes pressing them briefly, and then looking up with an expression that was simultaneously proud and terrified and overwhelmed and absolutely undone. And she thought, "This is my life. This is the life." They named him Eli Dale Maddox. The Eli was for Cord's younger brother, who had become a friend of the ranch, and the Dale was for Callie's father, not to honor the failures of the man, but to honor the simple fact that he had existed and had given her life, which was worth naming something for regardless of the rest. Inez held the baby that first evening with the practiced ease of a woman who remembered doing this, and the baby, who had been loudly opinionated about everything since his arrival, went quiet in her arms with the absolute trust of the very newly arrived, and Inez looked down at him with an expression that stripped away every year of careful management, and showed, simply and completely, what was underneath all of it. She looked up and found John Maddox watching her from the doorway, and she said, "He looks like her." "He does," Maddox agreed. "Same eyes." Inez looked back at the baby. "Gray," she said. "Our eyes," she paused. "All of ours now." John moved into the room and sat beside her, and she gave him his son to hold, and he took the child with the careful reverence of a man aware of exactly how significant this was, and he looked at Eli Dale with those dark eyes gone soft and full, and Inez watched him, the last of the watching she had always done, not the careful scrutiny of someone looking for the lie, but the quiet attention of a woman who had been watching long enough to know she would not find one. She reached over and put her hand briefly on his arm. That was, from Inez Rourke, the most significant gesture she had ever given a man outside of her husband, and they both knew it. The spring of 1896 into 1897 was an era of growth on the Double R that Callie tracked in the accounts with a satisfaction that was partly practical and partly something deeper. The satisfaction of watching a thing she had chosen continue to prove itself worth choosing. The herd grew. The land produced. The supply contract with the Austin buyer renewed and expanded. Maddox hired one more man, a young cowhand named Pablo Ruiz, who had come up from the border country with solid references and excellent roping skills. And the ranch had the hum of a working operation that had found its footing. Eli grew with the loud enthusiasm of a boy in wide-open country, crawling and then walking and then running across the ranch yard with an energy that required considerable supervision, and that Maddox met with a patience that surprised even Callie, who had already known him to be a patient man. He would carry the boy on the big roan, who was getting old now, more gray in the muzzle across the pasture in the long summer evenings, talking to him about the land and the animals in the low, steady voice that Eli appeared to find as calming as his father's presence. And Callie would watch from the porch with her coffee, and a feeling in her chest that was the deepest, quietest form of happiness she knew. In the fall of 1897, Callie told John she was expecting again. He smiled this time with immediate and unguarded joy, and asked the same first question, "Are you feeling all right?" And she told him, "Yes, I am," and he kissed her in the kitchen in the afternoon light, and little Eli, from his position on the floor surrounded by wooden blocks, looked up at his parents and said, with the imperious confidence of a 1-year-old, "Duh," which was not relevant to the conversation but was well received nonetheless. Inez, when she heard, said, "Good," which from Inez was effusive. The second child was born in the spring of 1898, a girl this time, smaller than Eli had been but considerably more serene about the whole enterprise. They named her Rosa Inez Maddox. The Inez was not a question. It was a decision that both John and Callie had arrived at separately, and found, when they brought it up, that they had both arrived at the same answer. When Callie told her mother what the baby was named, Inez went absolutely still. She was holding Rosa at the time, and the baby had her grandmother's gray eyes and was looking up at Inez with the unclouded attention of the very young, and Inez pressed her lips together and breathed carefully and then said, with a voice she had to work for, "That's a good name." "It's your name," Callie said. "It should belong to someone worth giving it to." Inez looked at her daughter and then at the baby, and she said quietly, "I hope she grows up in a world that has been kinder to her than mine was to me." "She will have us," John said from the doorway. "That's a start." Inez looked at him over the baby's head with those gray eyes that had spent so many years watching, measuring, guarding, and what was in them now was something that had no guardedness in it at all. Just a woman in her late 50s, holding her granddaughter in the kitchen of the ranch her son-in-law had built, on the land of the life her daughter had built with him, with the evening coming in through the open window and the smell of cedar on the air. "John," she said, and his name in her mouth had a warmth it had taken years to earn and was worth every one of them. "Yes," he said. "Thank you," she said simply. He came into the kitchen and sat with her and the baby, and Callie brought the coffee, and Eli came pattering in from the yard with cedar dust on his hands, and climbed into his father's lap with the assumption of welcome. And outside on the Double R the evening settled over the Cedar Hills in its golden particular way, and Harlow Creek held the weight of all of them, the town that had watched and waited and formed its opinions and revised them. And it was all of it, every piece of it, exactly as it should be. The years after Rosa's birth had a quality that Callie would later try to describe to her children, and find that description was insufficient, that some things can only be lived, not rendered. They were working years, the years that a ranch and a family are built in, and they had their difficulties, a drought in 1899 that required real management of the water and the herd, a coyote problem in 1900 that Augusto addressed with the focused efficiency of a man who had seen worse, a winter in 1901 that was harder than most and required Maddox and the Stetler brothers to work through several consecutive nights to pull, calves safely through. But they were also years of the particular richness that comes from a life built on solid ground with a person you have chosen, and who has chosen you in full knowledge of what the choosing means. Callie and John Maddox argued sometimes, because they were both direct people with strong opinions, and a ranch and a family gave plenty of material for disagreement. And those arguments were heated and honest, and resolved without lasting damage, because they were rooted in mutual respect and a shared investment in getting things right. She was right more often than she had initially expected him to acknowledge, and he acknowledged it with a directness she had come to take for granted in the best possible way. He was right more often than she initially liked to admit, and she admitted it with the same straightforwardness she gave everything. Eli grew into a boy who had his father's steadiness and his mother's quickness, and a laugh that made everyone in the room feel the day was better than they had thought. He learned horses from Augusto, who regarded this as a sacred duty and took it extremely seriously. He learned the land from his father, riding out from the time he was old enough to sit a saddle independently. He learned accounts from his mother, who sat with him at the kitchen table and taught him the same careful record-keeping she had learned at the dry goods counter. He learned, from watching his parents and his grandmother, something about what it looked like to do the right thing consistently, and why it mattered, which is the most important thing a child can learn and cannot be taught directly. Rosa grew into herself with the serene determination she had shown from her first day. A child who played quietly alone for longer than most children, but who, when she engaged, did so with a focus and a completeness that people noticed. She had her grandmother's gray eyes and her grandmother's tendency toward observation. She made her grandmother laugh in a way that Callie had not heard her mother laugh before, the deep belly laugh of someone genuinely caught off guard by joy. Inez came to the Double R every Sunday through those years without fail. In 1900 she sold the dry goods store. She had been offered a fair price by the Bauer family's eldest son, who was setting up in business, and the timing was right. And with the money and the income from the land sale she had made years prior, she was comfortable. She kept her house on the South Road, her kitchen garden, her 6 hens. She attended the Methodist church and the occasional social, and she was, in the second decade of the 20th century's approach, a woman who had found, if not the happiness she might have had in another life, something that was genuinely its own kind of good. She and John Maddox had, by this point, an ease between them that neither had expected at the outset. They argued about cattle prices and the weather and the best method for treating rust on garden tools, and they agreed about books and the importance of honest dealing and the particular quality of light in the hill country in October. She called him John. He called her Inez. On cold Sunday evenings, she sat in the chair that had come to be understood as hers in the ranch house sitting room, and John sat with his coffee, and they read their separate books in the good lamplight while Callie put the children to bed and came back to join them. And the evenings had a quality that all 3 of them, each in their own register, recognized as grace. In October of 1901, Inez Rourke turned 60 years old, and the Double R held a birthday supper that Callie and John organized together with the help of nearly the entire Harlow Creek community. Because by 1901, Inez was as much a fixture of the town's story as anyone, and people felt that 60 years deserved marking. There were tables on the porch and in the yard, and the Stetler brothers played music because it turned out Cord played fiddle, and Mrs. Palasuk, who was now, impossibly, somewhere north of 80 and still bringing seedlings to the spring social, sat at the head of the table next to Inez and held her hand for most of the evening. Inez sat through the supper with a composure that did not quite conceal how moved she was, and she spoke, when Maddox stood and raised a glass to her, with the measured, careful words of a woman who had been thinking about what she wanted to say. She said, "I raised my daughter to trust no man. I raised her that way because I had been hurt and I was afraid and I wanted to keep her safe from what had hurt me. What I did not fully understand then was the difference between teaching a person to be careful and teaching them to be closed, and I taught her too much of the second and not enough of the first. She paused, and her gray eyes went to Callie, who was sitting beside John with Rosa asleep on her lap and Eli pressed against his father's side. She trusted one man. And she was right and I was wrong. And instead of that being the end of her story, which is what I was afraid it would be, it was the beginning of the best part of mine. She raised her glass and John Maddox across the table raised his, and the whole yard raised theirs, and the cedar hills held the sound of it, and the October evening came down golden and particular and perfect over the Double R, over Harlow Creek, over all of them. After the supper, when the guests had gone and the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet, Callie stood with John on the porch looking at the stars. He had his arm around her and she had her head against his shoulder, which was a configuration she had arrived at over years of evenings, and that fit perfectly. The way things fit when they have been chosen and lived in long enough to become the true shape of things. "She means it," Callie said. "Every word." "I know," he said. "I heard her. She never thought she would say any of that. People surprise themselves," he said, "especially when they've been watching carefully enough." Callie looked up at him. In the starlight he looked much as he had the first time she had seen him clearly, the strong jaw and the dark eyes and the crooked nose, all of it weathered a little more now by 5 years of hill country sun and work, all of it more familiar than anything had ever been. "She asked to meet you," Callie said. "That first time she asked me to bring you to supper. She said she had heard my voice change when I talked about you. Your voice changed," he said with that quality that was almost amused. "My voice," she said. "My whole face apparently. She missed nothing." "She never does," he said. The stars over the hill country were enormous and old and completely indifferent to the small, bright, particular lives arranged beneath them, which was not a diminishment but a comfort, the reminder that the universe was large and the evenings were long and there was time. There was genuine time to do all of this right. "I'm happy," Callie said simply. "Good," he said. He pressed his lips to the top of her head, which he had been doing since before they were married and which still, reliably, made her feel held. "So am I." In the years after, Harlow Creek grew slowly, the way hill country towns grew, not in any rush, but with a steady accumulation of people and story. The Double R grew with it, adding land to its east, selling some in the south to a family named Garza who ran sheep, which Augusto regarded as a complicated but acceptable compromise. Eli Maddox, at 10 years old, could ride as well as any grown man on the ranch, and was beginning to show a serious aptitude for the numbers side of the operation, which Callie tracked with a quiet satisfaction. Rosa Maddox, at 8, had taken to reading with a devotion that reminded John of his own young self in Missouri, and Callie brought her books from every source she could access, the lending library, occasional orders from San Antonio, trades with the schoolteacher's family. Rosa read everything without discrimination, and with a thoroughness that suggested she was storing it all for some purpose not yet clear, which Inez said, watching her granddaughter with a book, was exactly what serious people did. In 1903, Callie found she was expecting a third child, and she and John received the news the same way they had received all their news, together with honesty, with the grounded joy of two people who understood that their life was large enough to hold more. Inez, at her Sunday supper, held Callie's hands across the table and looked at her with those gray eyes that saw everything and said, "You look well, better than the last 2 times." "I feel well," Callie said. John beside her was trying not to look as pleased as he was and not succeeding. "John," Inez said. "Yes," he said. "Stop trying to hide how happy you are," she said. "It is unbecoming." He laughed the full laugh, the one that filled a room, and even Inez smiled, the unguarded smile that he had managed over 8 years to earn from her with some regularity. The third child was a boy, born in the summer of 1903, a solid and cheerful child who arrived with considerably less drama than Eli and considerably less serenity than Rosa, and seemed, from the first, to find the world an excellent place. They named him Thomas Augusto Maddox, the Augusto for the man who had helped build the ranch from its first season, and who, at the announcement, put his hat over his face for a moment and said something in Spanish that Callie did not entirely translate, but that she understood from his manner to be the expression of a man profoundly moved. Augusto Vila held his namesake at the christening in the Methodist church in Harlow Creek. Callie and John had asked him to stand as one of the godparents, along with Cord Stetler, who was now married himself to a woman named Sarah who had brought tremendous order and excellent baking to the Stetler household. And he held the baby Thomas with the same care he gave the most valuable animals on the ranch, which was the highest care he knew how to give, and looked down at the boy with an expression that suggested the universe had, on balance, done right by him. The summer of 1903 passed, and the fall came in, and the hill country went its particular gold and rust, and the Double R stood in the middle of it all with its solid cedar post fences, and its good barn and its kitchen garden and its porch, where on Sunday evenings you could sit with a cup of coffee and watch the light go out over the hills and feel that you were, in some deep and inarguable sense, at home. Inez Rourke sat on that porch on a Sunday in October of 1903, with baby Thomas in her arms and Eli and Rosa cross-legged at her feet, arguing about something with the focused intensity of siblings who were also, despite themselves, genuinely fond of each other. And she looked out at the cedar hills going gold in the afternoon light, and she felt the particular quiet that had been coming over her more often in recent years. Not the wary quiet of someone watching for danger, but the settled quiet of someone who has done what they came to do. She had built something in her years of careful work and careful raising. She had built Callie. She had built, from the ground of one woman's grief and determination, a person who was capable and direct and brave enough to trust what was true. And what Callie had built from that, this ranch, this family, this marriage that was as real and solid as the land it sat on, was the best proof that Inez Rourke's 20 years of effort had been exactly right, even the parts that had been harder than they needed to be. She looked over at John Maddox, who was on the other end of the porch talking with Cord Stetler about the fall cattle prices, and she thought about the first time she had looked at him, across her kitchen table, those level dark eyes and the week's worth of stubble and the honest way he had answered her practical questions. And she thought that of all the things she had been wrong about in her life, the most meaningful one to be wrong about had been this. She had believed that men were a category, a weather pattern, an inevitability that led only one direction, and it turned out that a category could have exceptions, that weather could change, that the direction was not inevitable at all. Thomas made a small sound of baby contentment in her arms, and she looked down at him, and he was looking up at her with the absolute trust of his 8 weeks in his gray eyes, Callie's eyes. Inez's eyes were open and direct, and seeing everything with the pure interest of someone for whom the world is entirely new. "Hello," she said to him quietly. He looked at her with those gray eyes and blinked once and appeared satisfied. "Your grandmother," she told him, "made some mistakes. But she also did a few things right, and this is one of them." She looked up at Callie, who was coming through the door with the coffee pot, and Callie looked at her mother's face and smiled, that full silver-eyed smile that she had given since childhood and that Inez had always found when it was directed at her, a kind of warmth she had tried all her life to deserve. "What are you telling him?" Callie asked, sitting down and pouring coffee into the cups. "The truth," Inez said. "The way I should have been telling it all along." Callie set down the coffee pot and looked at her mother with a tenderness that was not new but that had dimensions now that it had not had before, the tenderness of a woman who understood, from the inside, what her mother had done and what it had cost, and who had never once stopped being grateful for it even when she had been taught things she later needed to unlearn. "Mama," she said. "Don't," Inez said, with a hint of her old dryness. "I'm holding a baby and I will not be made to cry." Callie laughed, And John looked over from his conversation with Cord and smiled. That particular smile that she had been watching transform his face since the May social 8 years ago. And the afternoon held them all, the porch, the hills, the coffee, the children. The old vaquero and the Stetler brother, and the woman who had built everything from nothing, and the man who had ridden in from the north on a tired roan horse, and the woman between them who had trusted what was true, held all of them in the golden October light. And the cedar hills went on and on to the east, and the south and the north, patient and permanent and wild, the way the land had always been, the way it would be long. After all of them were part of it, and for now, for this particular and irreplaceable now, it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, altogether, a very good life.